studying communication with an emphasis in PR. So I'm from the great city of St. Louis. Go Cardinals! I always tell people that my dream job is to work in the PR department for them because my only two personality traits are the St. Louis Cardinals and St. Louis. Just kidding. A little bit about myself. Disco music gives me so much serotonin. I love it so much that I have a disco-inspired tattoo on my ankle. And in 2017, Spotify told me that I listened to 42 hours of the Bee Gees that year. In other words, they said, Jaynie, we're begging you to get a new hobby. Another fun fact is I had a very popular One Direction YouTube channel back in the day. So yes, I did peak at age 12. And yes, I will be signing autographs after this. And lastly, I love to snowboard. I've been snowboarding since like 4th grade. And if you're wondering if I'm any good, here's one of my highlights. Yeah, so I do go by the name Shaun White as well. So growing up, I've always been a very type A personality. I like to joke around a lot, but I'm very ambitious and I set high expectations for myself when it comes to school and my involvement. In high school, I participated in many service and community events. But soon, though, my whole world just started to get wrapped up in this idea of being a picture-perfect citizen. When it came to helping others, I had ulterior motives. I wanted people to see me as the girl who was for justice, for peace, for equality. Just really the girl who did it all. But I was so focused on my reputation, and I was neither intentional nor truly passionate about the issues that I advocated for. So I still struggle with my intentionality literally like every week in college. Honestly, and if I'm really doing things for the right reasons. But what I want to get us thinking about is this idea of being more in love with the idea of changing the world than actually changing it. We have a lot of imperfect ways of thinking as Christians. So I ask you to ponder this question throughout the night. Are we more in love with the idea of changing the world than actually changing it? So I've already mentioned it once, but what exactly is this idea of social justice? When we think of social justice, we think of making things right. We think of an overall good and righteous outcome. We all love it and we all long for it. But we don't really like to look at the dark parts of it, the tragic stories that happen all across the world every single day. But in order to fully understand this definition, we have to address what and where it goes wrong. So that's when injustice comes into play. Injustice occurs where there's a lack of fairness in our world. Social injustice issues are things like unfair labor practices, climate justice, racial discrimination, gun violence, food insecurity, sex trafficking, and this list goes on. Social injustice is seen in every nook and cranny of this world, this year more than ever. When the video of George Floyd came out this past May, my heart sunk. My hopes were crushed. I was filled with utter despair, sorrow, anger, and grief. Staying silent seemed wrong, even though I felt it would be better to listen than to speak. I was struggling between my role as a Christian and my role as a citizen. As a Christian, my role was to pray and to listen. But as a citizen, my role was to reflect on my own perspective and stand up for policy solutions. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that I wanted to be prayerful, because I was absolutely outraged. Honestly, when churches kept telling me to pray, I thought, how can I pray about this same thing that has happened millions of times over and over again? How is our God so good if he is letting these injustices keep happening? I was enraged that another innocent Black person was shamelessly murdered, and not knowing what role I played in the fight for justice didn't ease that process. I think when we witness some unspeakable evil, we can all relate to this feeling of doubt. Our big tendency is to blame God and instead of the person who committed the crime. So what happened to us? Why do these things continue to erupt in our society? The root of it is sin. Sin is the system beneath the system. It's the structure behind every single one of those stories that we hear. When a police officer abuses his or her power, that's the mess of sin. When millions of refugees are forced to leave their country to escape war, persecution, or natural disaster, and they don't get equal access to opportunities in the process, that's the mess of sin. When gun violence continuously takes on mass forms and impacts those who have been injured, killed, and the families of those affected for the long term, that's the mess of sin. In understanding my role in all of this and also preparing for my service and justice internship here at Newman, I did a lot of educational reading. And the overarching theme in social justice is really quite simple. You see, the building blocks of Catholic social teaching lie in human dignity and the sacredness of life, as well as protecting human rights and responsibilities. We must care for God's creation, and we must learn to think and act generously to the most vulnerable. As Catholics, we are called to a lifetime commitment of loving each other as one human family. In loving each other is the capacity to be open to learn and to change. That's what Jesus would do. We cannot walk in that tension or open our eyes unless we are willing to listen to things that are uncomfortable or even offend us. We cannot grieve over others' pain unless we first quiet our need to minimize, justify, or fix that pain. We must listen to other voices, especially those that are different from ours, if we are really going to understand the world around us. God did not promise a life of comfort. He did promise that He would be with us every step of the way. After all, we have to recognize that justice is not peripheral, but rather central to God's story. One story that specifically illustrates God's hearts towards immigrants and refugees is the story of Ruth. Elimelech and his wife Naomi, along with their 2 sons, traveled to Moab. After both her husbands and sons die there, Naomi is left alone, without children and without economic or social standing. So Naomi decides to travel back home. While one of her daughter-in-laws returned to her mother, the other, Ruth, famously stayed with Naomi. But even with Ruth's help, they arrived in Bethlehem poor and hungry. Hunger wasn't the only danger that threatened Ruth. Like farm workers before her and since, she faced sexual violence too. However, a man named Boaz offered her the safety of the company of other women. But she wanted more than that. She wanted to be a full member of society. So confidently and bravely, she propositioned Boaz for marriage. They marry, and she is accepted into the community because compassion overrode law. We see here that God provided for the poor and included immigrants in the people of God. You see, our role is in fact contextualizing the sacredness of human life. As God is just and loving, so are we called to do justice and to live in love. Because it's not about us just doing justice, it's also about us allowing the work of justice to change us. Our calling is not simply to change the world, but also to be changed ourselves. That's what's pretty baller about God. He can open eyes. He patiently teaches, corrects and changes us more into the image of his Son. He tells us that mercy, which is essentially just compassion, he tells us that mercy and justice are not two contradictory realities, but rather two dimensions that unfold into love. We don't have to be perfect in practicing this, but we need to be open to the acceptance. This past June, Lakers center Dwight Howard released a very powerful statement about social injustice and racism. He said, basketball or entertainment period isn't needed at this moment, and it will only be a distraction. And no basketball until we get things resolved. You see, everybody was really just still talking about whether basketball should be played. He isn't saying that basketball shouldn't be. He's just saying that you should not be taking attention away from what's going on in the country to talk about basketball. Don't get me wrong, I love sports. But at the end of the day, it's just a sport. What's going on with people in the streets dying, that's something real. That statement, it had nothing to do with sports. It had everything to do with racism and social justice. So when I really started to advocate and become more vocal about social justice, I felt empowered. I was donating, sharing resources, and using my white privilege to fight for these issues. I had truly become socially present and civically engaged. I never knew about so many of these issues that were prevalent, but I learned that there were a lot of roadblocks along the way, and in the most painful way possible. Some of the people who I thought were my friends unfollowed me on social media. A lot of them were Christians in my own community. They stopped talking to me. They stopped supporting me. I was left shocked and hurt. These were people who I considered to be really, really close friends. I was confused as to how these same people who preached loving one another so hard despite adversity weren't actually practicing it with me. I kept asking, what's wrong with me? Can't they look past these differences in opinion and just love me for me? Honestly, after our 5-month-long break ended this past August, the thought of even coming around Newman made me sick to my stomach. I associated that pain that I experienced with the chapel. But I was a hypocrite in this too, though. I began to fixate on those differences in opinion. These people that I once loved so much, I began to question. I couldn't look past it. I started to see them as flawed human beings, and only that. I was compassionless in understanding their way of thinking. I'm not gonna lie, this has been my biggest struggle of 2020. Becoming very passionate about social justice has led me to become passionate only in my way of thinking. But 1 John 4:20 says, if we don't love people we can see, how can we love God, whom we cannot see? Simply put, we are hypocrites if we don't live out this call. We are not practicing what we so often preach. For social justice to work in a Christian context, we must be ready to share why we act. It's more than sharing graphics on social media. It's more than liking Facebook posts. It's more than retweeting what other people say. Don't get me wrong, you can still learn by doing these things. But like I said, it's so much more than that. So what are the practical steps that we can take to live out our lives moving forward? The first step is to simply pray and trust God. So whenever the weight of the world is consuming me, I just feel hopeless. But whenever I bring those worries to God, I always feel much better. By praying, we become more like Jesus. So then we can start to love those people out of our hearts, just like Jesus did. It becomes natural, it's not forced, and it's not out of those ulterior motives that we talked about. The second step is educating ourselves. There are many ways to do this. We talked about social Catholic teachings earlier, but I also really like amazing podcasts, books, documentaries, and articles. Some of my favorites include the Netflix documentary 13th and the podcast Intersectionality Matters. In educating ourselves, we recall that social justice is opening the doors of access to everyone. If you're Catholic, it's recognizing that pro-life also means standing up for the dignity of the LGBTQ community, fighting for the lives of immigrants, advocating for Black lives, and doing our part to minimize the spread of COVID. These are commandments in the Bible. If we do not believe this, then we cannot fight for the rights of humans and work to make things better, the core of social justice. The third step is to treat others with dignity and respect. There's a famous quote that tells us, when we treat others as inhuman, we become inhuman ourselves. So this is a little bit intense, but I think it really hit me hard when I first heard it. It's really similar to the golden rule, which a lot of us are not really that foreign to. Treat others the way you would want to be treated. So if we can practice day-by-day actions that can lead us to this, we can see that dignity and respect is not such a radical concept. So the fourth step is having open conversations. I think a lot of the time when someone questions your way of thinking, our immediate reaction is to get on the defensive. I know I do it. Engaging with other people's worldviews is not only okay, but it's good. We all come from different socioeconomic backgrounds and upbringings, and recognizing that my life experience may have been easier than yours is one step closer to achieving peace. Remember that we are not a light to the light, but rather a light to the world. So I am not a master of all of these steps. Everything that I've discussed tonight, I still struggle with. I am so far from perfect. But I am working, and what we can all do is improve and recognize that we have a role as Christians and Catholics alike to fight for justice. That we have ears to hear and eyes to see, and the Lord made them both. So every time we use our voice and influence to get in the way of injustice, whether it's human trafficking, economic exploitation, human rights abuses, or infants dying needlessly from disease or malnutrition, remember what Jesus would do. He would love. This journey will not be easy or simple or convenient. It rarely is. But giving the world a glimpse of the justice will be worth it. It is a bright light shining during a dark time in history. I want you guys to join me in a little prayer here. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. I pray that as fellow Christians, we can re-envision God's call for social justice, which is rooted in Scripture and faith. That we fall in love with changing the world and not just the idea of it. That we can recommit to advancing social justice, not as an extracurricular or an optional part of our faith, but as an imperative. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Thank you.